Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unworthy History. Today I'm going to bring you some actual history from this book right here, Indian Depredations in Texas by J.W. Wilbarger, published back in 1889. Now, the story today closely follows upon Colonel Moore's expedition against a Comanche encampment on the San Saba River. This is when the Comanches came back and retaliated for that. It's called the Battle of Brushy. Just as Colonel Moore's party were returning from their expedition against the Comanches upon the San Saba about the 18th of February, 1839, citizens along the Colorado River Valley from Bastrop to Austin were thrown into a high state of excitement by the report that the Indians had made an attack upon the settlers of Wells or Weber Prairie, or perhaps both. The news going up and down the river as rapidly as the facilities of the day would permit soon brought together squad after squad of citizen soldiers, all eager to ascertain the cause of the alarm, which proved to be a large body of Indians, variously estimated at from 200 to 300, who had made a sudden attack upon the upper end of Wells Prairie, killing Mrs. Captain Coleman and her son Albert, a lad of about 15 years old, and robbing the house of Dr. J.W. Robertson, who at the time happened to be on a visit with his family at the residence of his neighbor and brother-in-law, Colonel Henry Jones. Mrs. Coleman early in the morning was with her family out in a small field or garden patch which lay between the bottom timbers of Coleman Branch and the Colorado Bottom, when they were suddenly charged upon by a large body of Indians who came up whooping and yelling as they emerged from their hiding places nearby the residence. James Coleman and a man by the name of Rogers made good their retreat to the Colorado River bottom, while Mrs. Coleman with the rest of the family ran towards the house, which all succeeded in gaining except little Tommy, a boy about 5 years old who was taken prisoner. The attack was so sudden and the panic so complete that Mrs. Coleman did not perhaps think of the fate of her children until she reached the door of her humble cabin, when her mother's love induced her to look back to see what had become of them, only to receive an arrow wound exactly in the throat, from the effects of which she soon expired. But before expiring she exclaimed, "O children, I am killed." Then turning to her eldest son, she said, "Albert, my son, I am dying. Get the guns and defend your sisters." Albert, a mere lad of about 15 years of age, and his little sisters were the only persons left to defend the house, and their already murdered mother from further injuries of the inhumane, brutal Indians. Young Albert fought with heroic bravery for a while, killing and wounding some 3 or 4 of the enemy, but finally he received a wound which in very short time proved fatal, and he breathed his last with his head pillowed in the lap of his oldest sister, the last words he uttered being, "Sister, I can't do any more for you. Farewell." This left his 2 little sisters to take care of themselves as best they could. The little girls, who had taken refuge under the bed after the death of their brother, kept up a conversation with each other as they had been told to do, which doubtless deterred the Indians from entering the house, thereby saving their lives and the house from being plundered. The Indians now began to withdraw, halting at the house of Dr. J.W. Robertson, robbing it of its contents, ripping open the feather beds in the open air, and thus giving the country around a very singular appearance, and carrying off 7 captive of the doctor's slaves. About noon, the citizens from above, 25 in number, had collected, and electing Jacob Burleson their captain, began immediately to reconnoiter, and some 2 hours later they were joined by 27 men under the leadership of Captain James Rogers from below, brother-in-law of Captain Burleson, making in all 52 men. So eager were the men for the chase that they concluded not to go into any further election of officers, but to march in double file, and for Rogers and Burleson to ride each at the head of one file and command the same. About 10 o'clock the next day, says Mr. Atkinson, who was present and participated in the battle, we descended a long prairie slope leading down to a dry run, a little above and opposite Post Oak Island, and when about 3 miles north of Brushy, we came in sight of the enemy. On the run and directly north and in front of us was a thicket, and the enemy, when first discovered, were about 1/2 mile above, and to the west of this thicket, bearing down towards the same, and as we thought, with the intention of taking possession of and giving us battle from it. We immediately agreed to charge up, open file, flanking to the right and left, cutting the Indians off from and taking possession of the thicket ourselves. The larger portion of the enemy being on foot, and we all well mounted, we could and ought to have taken possession of that thicket, and we would have done so but for the flinching of a few men, which threw the whole command into a state of confusion, resulting in the death of Captain Burleson, and our inglorious flight from the field, leaving his remains to the mercy of the enemy. There were those of us who dismounted and hitched our horses as often as 3 times, but at last had to retreat, and in doing so the horse of W. Wallace became frightened, pulled away from him, and ran among the Indians, leaving the gallant Texan on foot in the midst of this conflict. His horse was soon mounted by one of the Indian warriors, who appropriated him for his own use. Just at this time, Captain Jack Haney, observing the perilous situation of Wallace, made a dash for him, pulled him up behind him on his horse, and both made good their retreat. For the rescue of Wallace by Captain Haney, the latter was presented with an elegant rifle, handsomely mounted by the father of Wallace, who was then living in Tennessee. The whole command fell back to Brushy, the Indians making no attempt to follow us. In a line 1 mile in length, the main body of us mortified at the result of the morning's conflict, unwilling and ashamed to return to the settlements without a fight, and being loath to leave the dead body of the gallant captain up on the field, we halted at Brushy, not knowing what to do. But while halted there in a state of indecision, General Ed Burleson, who had heard of the raid made by the Indians, raised 32 men, followed our trail, halted, and brought back those of our men who had so precipitately fled in the morning. This reinforcement swelled our number to 84 men, with General Edward Burleson in command, assisted by Captain Jesse Billingsley, who had distinguished himself at the Battle of San Jacinto. After a general consultation and exchange of opinions, the whole command moved on sorrowfully, yet determined to retrieve the fortunes of the morning. About 2:00 p.m. we struck the enemy, but not where we were expected to find them. Instead of occupying the thicket, they had selected a very strong hold in the shape of a horseshoe, with very high and rising ground at the toe. The direction we would approach them unless we changed base, which after reconnoitering them for a while and exchanging a few shots we did, dropping down, crossing the run, and dividing our command, one party under the command of Captain Billingsley, taking possession of the run below the Indians, while the other party went above and gained possession of a small ravine, which emptied into the main one just above the Indians. Our intention being to work our way down and drive the enemy before us, while Captain Billingsley was to work his way up to the ravine, thus securing a complete rout of the Indians. But nature and fortune seemed to favor the enemy that day. The ravines leading from each of our little commands to where the enemy lay massed behind high banks on either side spread out into an open plot 40 or 50 yards before reaching them, which would make it extremely dangerous for us to carry out our plans. Thus, failing in our attempt to rout and chastise the enemy and recapture the prisoners they held in possession, we were forced to select safe positions, watch for opportunities, and whenever an Indian showed himself, to draw down on him and send the messenger of death to dispatch him. In this manner the fight lasted until sundown, the Indians retreating under the cover of night and leaving us in possession of the field, putting up the most distressing cries and bitter lamentations ever uttered by mortal lips or heard by mortal ears. We camped on the battlefield that night, and early next morning the sad duty devolved upon us to make litters to convey our dead and dying to the settlements. How many Indians were killed we have no means of knowing. Their bitter wails indicated that their loss was great, either in quantity or quality, perhaps both. We lost during the day 4 of our best and prominent citizens, to wit, Jacob Burleson, Edward Blakey, John Walters, and Reverend James Gilliland. The last named lived some 10 days after receiving his wound. I have been thus particular in mentioning the names of those who fell in the day's conflicts, that their names may be enrolled high up in the temple of Texas liberty, and find a niche in the hearts of an appreciative people. For no slab of pallid marble with white and ghastly head tells the wanderers in our vale the virtues of our dead. The wildflowers be their tombstone, and dewdrops pure and bright, their epitaph the angels wrote in the stillness of the night. So that's the end of this story. This was the Battle of the Brushy that seemed to have been revenge for Colonel Moore's expedition against the Comanche encampment on the San Saba River earlier in 1839. So this occurred again when Comanches came down the Colorado River and attacked settlements between Austin and Bastrop. So if you want to hear more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.